Welcome to Train Signal. This is the Configuring Malware Inspection lesson in the Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 training course. Let's start this lesson with a discussion on exactly what the Malware Protection feature and the Malware Inspection feature in Threat Management Gateway 2010 actually does. Next, we'll talk about how you get this feature and how you license it with regard to Threat Management Gateway. Next, we'll talk about how the Malware Protection feature actually operates, and we'll talk about configuring malware inspection policies. Since malware inspection can sometimes interfere with normal business operations, we'll talk about how you can exclude certain resources from these critical inspection rules. Keeping current with malware definitions is a key component of any security policy, and that's what we'll discuss next in this lesson. Balancing security and usability is always a tricky task, so we'll talk about optimizing the user experience and some steps you can take to make things just a little bit better for your users, even as you protect them and the organization from outside threats. From there, we'll move on to some content delivery options and then have a short discussion about what's called the Microsoft Telemetry Service. And we'll wrap up with configuring malware options in an actual rule on Threat Management Gateway. A few months ago, a well-meaning user at Global Mantex downloaded a security program to his system. He thought this would optimize the speed of his computer. In fact, this security program was actually a keylogging Trojan horse that placed Global Mantex into a vulnerable state very quickly. Although this incident was very quickly rectified, it did demonstrate the need for improved malware protection capabilities inside the organization. By the end of this lesson, Global Mantex will understand the need for malware protection and how the service actually operates in Forefront Threat Management Gateway. There will also be an understanding that the service is not part of the base Threat Management Gateway license, and you will learn how to mitigate malware-based threats via Forefront Threat Management Gateway. So what is malware protection and malware inspection? And really the reason that I say both of those phrases is they're relatively interchangeable with regard to Forefront Threat Management Gateway. So when I say malware inspection or I say malware protection, it's really the same thing. It's important to understand both what it is and what it isn't, and we're going to talk about both of these things in this lesson. First of all, malware is the term used to describe the set of threats encompassed by worms, viruses, and spyware. There used to be a day when everybody had virus scanners, and all it did was look for viruses and make sure the computers were protected from these virulent threats. Today, worms and spyware, and actually spyware is probably the more serious issue with regard to computer security. It's important to understand that even when traffic is allowed by firewall rules, the organization can still be at risk. So just because you've said bless the particular kind of traffic in the firewall, users can still download malware from sites that you allow. For example, suppose that Microsoft had a Trojan-laden copy of Windows sitting on their website. Malware, it could be inside that file, and Forefront Threat Management Gateway will allow you to download it because you're allowed to go to the Microsoft website. This issue, when coupled with the fact that many organizations allow users administrative access to their PCs, can be a recipe for disaster. Now, you may think that allowing people administrative access to their PCs is insane. Well, unfortunately, in some organizations, you really can't get around it for multiple reasons. One, organizational politics. Two, not enough IT staff to actually manage in a lockdown environment. All kinds of issues raise their ugly head when it comes to trying to completely lock down an organization. It's also incredibly important to understand that no matter what you put in place on the firewall, malware inspection, turning it off, and just disconnect it from the internet and saying we're just going to disconnect ourselves won't necessarily fully protect the organization. After all, a user can simply carry a laptop behind the firewall, as you can see in that little diagram in the lower right-hand corner of the page. If that user brings an infected laptop in, there's not a whole lot your firewall can do about it because that traffic is not traversing your firewall to be inspected and blocked. Threat Management Gateway's malware inspection feature can block malware in its tracks. All web traffic is inspected, and if found to be harboring malware, Threat Management Gateway handles it by either trying to remove the malware or blocking the transfer completely. Malware inspection is a Threat Management Gateway web filter. This filter protects outbound traffic, which is HTTP-based traffic. Now, outbound traffic is traffic that is requested from inside the firewall and returns information from public web servers and other sites. In your diagram that you see in the lower right-hand corner there, you can see that there are three things that happen. First of all, a request is made to an infected website from the little green computer that you see. The site then returns malware-laden packets, but Threat Management Gateway will block that traffic as long as that laptop hasn't simply been carried inside the firewall. You may remember earlier in this course, when we went through the initial configuration wizards, we actually enabled Malware Inspection as a feature when we installed the evaluation license for the feature set that includes Malware Inspection. This was what happened in the Forefront Threat Management Gateway post-installation configure tasks lesson in this course. And as you can see by the screenshots on your screen, the area that's highlighted in blue shows that we've activated the evaluation license, and it has an expiration of September 8th of 2011, which is far enough into the future for the purposes of this course. When it comes to malware inspection, there's a couple of things you need to keep in mind with regard to the license. First of all, malware inspection is not included in the base Forefront Threat Management Gateway license. Malware inspection is included in a subscription-based service, which is called Forefront Threat Management Gateway Web Protection Services, that includes URL filtering and anti-malware or malware inspection. These features, again, are licensed separately from Forefront Threat Management Gateway, and the licensing process can be confusing. So take a look at the link on your screen to make sure that you're following Microsoft licensing guidelines with regard to malware inspection. If you're running the evaluation license in your own organization, make sure that you leave plenty of time in your evaluation license. Don't wait till the last minute to try to renew it. I have read some stories in Microsoft forums about malware inspection and the overall Web Protection Services license process being a little bit slow at times, so be careful about waiting too long so that you don't lose these key features in your security infrastructure. Now let's talk about how this service actually operates. When you go into the Threat Management Gateway console, if you choose Web Access Policy, you're going to see at the right-hand side of the screen that there's a Configure Malware Inspection item. And you can see on your screen there's a couple of screenshots about what this looks like. When you click the Malware Inspection item, you get 8 tabs on the Properties page, and the most basic item is on the General tab, which is Enable Malware Inspection. This actually enables the feature set on your Threat Management Gateway system, as long as it's licensed. There are a whole lot of different settings that you can choose from when it comes to managing malware inspection. First of all, on the General Settings page, there's some global settings which we talked about. And you have another option, which is to choose how you want to handle the initial download of malware inspection definitions or signatures. During the time that those signatures are being downloaded, if they have not been downloaded yet, you could be left in a vulnerable state because there could be a missing signature for a key piece of malware. So you have to make a decision. Do you simply want to block web traffic while the definitions are downloading, or do you want to allow users to use the internet while those definitions are downloading? And that's really up to the organization. On the inspection settings page of the properties area, there are a whole bunch of options to choose from, and we're going to go through these options so that you understand them, and then we're going to look at some demonstrations on the Global Mantic Threat Management Gateway system. First of all, the first option is, do you want to attempt to clean the files? If a file is detected that contains malware, do you want to try to clean it? If you choose not to clean it, it'll simply be blocked. If you choose this option, Threat Management Gateway will try to strip the malware from the file you're downloading. And again, any files that can't be cleaned will just simply be deleted from the system. By default, this feature is enabled. Next, do you want to block files which have low and medium severity threats associated with them? This feature is disabled by default, or this option, and this basically means that only high-level threats will be blocked. Do you want to block these lesser critical threats? This will increase the scanning sensitivity, but can also add additional false positive issues for your users to work around. Unfortunately, the different threat levels, low, medium, and high, are not well documented, so this feature is disabled by default, and enable it only if you're in a particularly high security environment, because it can create problems because of the lack of documentation on low and medium severity threats. At times, Threat Management Gateway may suspect that a file is infected with something, but it doesn't exactly know what the malware type is. If this happens, do you want Threat Management Gateway's malware inspection feature to block those kinds of files? By default, this option is enabled, so if a suspicious file is scanned, it will be blocked by TMG. There are times when a corrupted file might be downloaded from the internet. And by default, this option is disabled, but you can block the downloading of corrupted files. The reason this option is generally disabled is because it can create false positives and block actually good files from being downloaded. So again, this is one of those features where you can try it out, but if you have problems, disable it to make sure that your users are able to do their jobs. Now, can a file be scanned? What do you want to do if a file cannot be scanned? Do you want to block it or do you want to allow it? There are times when files can't be scanned. For example, password-protected zip files cannot be scanned by Threat Management Gateway because TMG doesn't have the password. By default, that file will be allowed to go through because TMG does not, by default, disable the ability for unscannable files to be moved off to the user. If, again, you're in a higher security environment, you may want to enable this feature so that those kinds of files are blocked, but that's going to create significant problems for your users and probably add significant load to your help desk. Another feature that's disabled by default, or another option, is the blocking of encrypted files. Again, Threat Management Gateway can't always scan encrypted files, although we'll be talking about HTTPS inspection elsewhere in this course. But just like any other file, encrypted files can contain malware. But do you want to block encrypted files or do you want to allow them? If you block encrypted files, you're going to, again, create a significant support load at your help desk. Another option you have at your disposal is to choose whether or not you want to block files if the scanning time begins to take too much time. By default, this is 300 seconds. And this is more about user experience. If a file is taking so long to download that they're actually waiting 5 minutes for a scan to run, there may be something wrong with the file, or you may not want to add that load onto the Threat Management Gateway server. So you'll block that file, but again, understand that the trade-off is probably going to be additional calls to the help desk. Some malware is delivered in zip files that are not password protected, but they're so deep that some scanners have trouble scanning every file in the zip file. The other problem you have with some of these kinds of zip files is they can create buffer overload conditions on a system, which when opened can leave the system vulnerable to attack by a file that could be nested particularly deep in the zip. So if you'd like, you can block files that have a huge level of depth in their archives. So by default, Threat Management Gateway says if this zip file has more than 20 levels, we're not going to allow that file to go through the system. Again, from a user experience and overall system performance standpoint, massive files can create a significant load on the Threat Management Gateway system. So if you have users that are downloading files that are in the multi-gigabyte range, it can create a significant performance issue on the Threat Management Gateway system. By default, any files that are larger than 1 gig are going to be blocked by Threat Management Gateway. You've got to decide if this file size is adequate. Global Mantic is going to increase this setting overall to 2 gigabytes, and we're going to do that in a demonstration in a little bit, but first we're going to take a look at how Malware Inspection operates. Before we move over for a demonstration of how the Malware Inspection feature works and to make configuration changes to meet Global Mantic's company policy, there's one more setting to discuss, and this is the file size at which we want to block archive files. Simply put, if an archive file unpet content is larger than, by default, 4 gigs, Threat Management Gateway will block that file. Again, there's 2 reasons. It can create performance issues and it can create disk space issues if too many users are doing this all at once. This feature is enabled by default, or this option, and you can modify that size if you like, and we're going to do that in just a second. Global Mantic has 2 changes they would like to make to the Malware Inspection policy that comes by default in Threat Management Gateway. First of all, they want to increase the base file size that's allowed to 2 gigs, and they're going to stop blocking encrypted files. We're going to do 2 things at this point. First, we're going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway setup that we have in our lab here, and we're going to go to the workstation for Global Mantic, and we're going to see exactly how Malware Inspection operates. Next, we're going to make configuration changes in the Threat Management Gateway console that meet the company needs. We're going to stop blocking encrypted files and increase that file size. I've now moved over to the Global Mantic workstation that we've been using for all of the examples so far in this course. And I've got 2 sites up at the top of the screen. One is the ICAR test site, which is a standard test site that you can use to test your malware capabilities or malware prevention capabilities in your own organization. Simply put, this company or this group hosts files that actually contain malware. Now, they don't contain real malware. They contain what's called a test signature. Every decent malware protection product on the planet includes the ability to prevent against this test signature. Now, it should be noted that the test signature and the resulting pop-up that you get that says this file is not allowed are not dangerous. Again, this is so that you can adequately test your protection mechanisms without having to try to introduce real malware into your environment. Now notice when I choose to download icar.com, which is an executable, anybody could download this from the internet. When I click it, I'm told by Threat Management Gateway that that file is blocked because it contains a virus. In this case, it contains the icar test file, and you can see that right on your screen. This is really good, and this is a way that you can make sure that your system is operating the way it's supposed to. And the fact that Forefront tells you that this is what's going on is fantastic, because if your users have a problem, it gives them clear information to call the help desk with. Now, for the purposes of demonstration, I've lowered the threshold at which Threat Management Gateway blocks downloaded files to 40 megabytes. Now remember, the default is 1 gigabyte, but you'll notice that I'm sitting here at the hosthop.com page, Network Test Tools, and I have a large file that I want to download. Now the 25 meg file will download just fine, but look what happens when I try to download a larger file. Again, I'm being told by Forefront that that file is blocked because of security policies, as files larger than 40 megabytes are not allowed. At this point, I can contact the help desk and ask to have that increased if I absolutely need that file, or be told how I can go around the system to get it. I think it's important that you can see exactly how these services operate. So I wanted to make sure you got to see how malware is handled and how large file downloads are handled, because those are a couple of different methods by which Threat Management Gateway attempts to protect systems. I'm now going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway console, and we're going to make a couple of modifications to the overall malware inspection policy. And here we are. You'll notice I have Web Access Policy selected, and I'm going to go over to the right-hand side of the screen and choose Configure Malware Inspection. You'll notice that I have on this front page the Malware Inspection item enabled. And I'm going to go to Inspection Settings, and you'll notice that this is set to, right now, 20 megabytes, but we wanted to change this to 2,000 megabytes. Actually, we should probably do it 2,048 because that's 2 gigabytes. And we'll put this at 4095, which is the default. So this puts us at double the default that we saw before, which is a gig, and we now allow 2 gigs worth of download for each user, and this is basically a single file. I've previously deselected block encrypted files. We do not want to block encrypted files for Global Mantics. So we got to make sure that that checkbox is deselected. Then we simply click Apply and OK. And now the rule set has changed, but we have to apply this new setting to the Forefront server. So we'll click Apply. If we wanted to provide a description, we would, and click the Apply button again. And now, I'll wait a minute, but once I go over to the workstation again, I will now be able to download that larger file. So let's go over and try that out. And here I am trying to download a 100 meg file. And you're going to see that Forefront Threat Management Gateway is downloading that file. And that I'm being told I shouldn't close my browser before the download process completes. You're going to notice this is not your typical download window. This is one of Forefront's trickling features that allows it to start streaming contents of the file to your workstation before the full file is actually downloaded. But it's still scanning the file in pieces as it comes down. There are times when policies were made to be broken. In this case, Global Mantics wants to make sure that some sites are actually excluded from malware inspection, and we'll talk about that soon. The company also wants to exclude an audit computer in the IT department so that that group can investigate malware issues without hindrance. Now, the problem with that is if that machine becomes infected with malware, it can infect other machines on the network. So the real-world safe way to accomplish this task is to place that audit machine on its own subnet or perimeter network. This prevents the possibility of an additional network-based attack taking place because of a single affected system. It basically isolates the machine that you're using for that kind of auditing. Threat Management Gateway has 2 overall exclusion options: destination exceptions and source exceptions. So what's a destination exception? You use a destination exception to exempt certain sites, domains, or destinations, such as the perimeter network or DMZ, from inspection. So what that means is from the internal network, you can tell Threat Management Gateway that certain places that are being visited are to be exempted from malware inspection rules. For example, suppose you have users that are constantly visiting servers that are hosted in the Threat Management Gateway DMZ. You could use a destination exception to make sure that those servers and the files that they provide to your users are not run through malware inspection, because all that does is add some overhead for servers you control. Now, there are some sites that are actually exempted by default in Threat Management Gateway, and these are anything to do with Microsoft.com, Windows.com, and WindowsUpdate.com. You can add exceptions for entire domains, as per those defaults that we talked about before. Anything that goes to Microsoft.com, whether it's www or whether it's some other DNS name at Microsoft.com, is going to be exempted from inspection rules. You can also have very specific sites, so just www.globalmantics.com, or Threat Management Gateway network entities. So you can tell Threat Management Gateway that one of the perimeter networks that you've defined is to be exempted from malware inspection. GlobalMantics is going to create exceptions for all globalmantics.com sites and all systems in the perimeter network. Let's go do that right now over on the GlobalMantics Threat Management Gateway server. Here we are in the Threat Management Gateway console, and you'll notice that I've got Web Access Policy selected, and I'm going to go over here and click Configure Malware Inspection. The second tab that you see is called Destination Exceptions, and that's what we're interested in. So I'm going to choose that, and you're going to see that we already have an entry here for sites that are exempt from malware inspection. I'm going to choose to edit this existing entry, and you're going to see that we already have some entries here. Those are those defaults that I told you about before. So right here, we're going to add star.globalmantics.com to exempt everything that goes to globalmantics.com from being run through malware inspection. And then we'll click OK. Now, I'm going to also add a network entity. And in this case, we want to add the perimeter network. And then we click the Add button and close. Now, you notice that this heading says, do not inspect content sent from these destinations. So, when users visit these destinations and they get content back, it's not going to be inspected. Then we simply click Apply and OK. And then we apply this new rule set, and it will restart the firewall rule set. And that's frankly all there is to creating destination exceptions. Now that you understand destination exceptions, let's talk about source exceptions. This time we're going to use a source exception to allow a computer or a bunch of computers to forego malware inspection. So your users will be sitting at a computer, and no matter where they go, they will not be subjected to malware inspection because that specific computer as a source is being exempted from that rule set. As I indicated before, GlobalMantics wants to exclude an audit computer in the IT department so that the group can investigate malware issues without any hindrance from the Threat Management Gateway rules. To do this safely, GlobalMantics will create a second perimeter network, add the audit computer, and then create the exception. This will make sure that the other computers on the network remain protected even while IT can do its security job. And will also allow GlobalMantics, if necessary, to easily establish multiple audit computers if it becomes necessary. So our goal here is to do this right. We're actually going to add another network to the Threat Management Gateway server. And we're going to put a computer on that network to act as the audit machine. Already what I've done is I've added to the virtual machine that's running Threat Management Gateway another network adapter. So I've added a fourth network adapter. And you saw this fourth network adapter back in the lab setup video, but now you're seeing where it comes into play. The other thing I've done is I've created a virtual network in Hyper-V that's just for audit purposes. And again, that was explained also back in the lab setup video, so I'm not going to go over that again here. But what I do want to show you is how I'm going to add that network to my Threat Management Gateway system. The other thing I've done is I've already reconfigured the workstation we've been using to operate on that audit network. So it's now operating instead of on the 10.1.1 VLAN, it's on the 10.2.1 network. And that is this new IP address, and you'll see that in just a second. So I'm going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway system now, and we're going to go through this process. I'm now in the Threat Management Gateway console, and I'm going to add this network. Remember, I've already added the adapter to the Hyper-V virtual machine on which Threat Management Gateway runs. So I'm going to the network option, and you're going to see that I've got a number of networks. Well, I don't have a network that's just for audit purposes, but I've got an adapter that I don't have added to Threat Management Gateway yet. Although you'll see the adapter itself on the Network Adapters page, there are no networks associated with it on the Networks page. So we're going to go to Create a New Network, and I'm going to choose to call this Audit, and I'll click Next. And I'm going to call this one a perimeter network. It could be either a perimeter or an internal network, but it doesn't really matter in this case, so we'll just choose perimeter because I denote it as a little less secure than the internal network. And click Next. And I'm going to click Add Adapter. And this kind, I'm going to choose the Audit Adapter. And you'll see that it's got an IP address of 10.2.1.1. And the route information shows that all the IP addresses are 10.2.1.0 through 10.2.1.255. And that's based on the subnet mask and the IP address of the network adapter. So we'll click OK, and click Next, and click Finish. We now have an audit network. Now if I wanted to, I could go to the properties and add a description, and then click OK again, and you'll get a description in the description field. Now I'm going to click the Apply button, and I'll put a description, and click Apply. You now see at the top of the page that the audit adapter has been added to the Threat Management Gateway system. I'm now going to go back to the Web Access Policy area, and what we've got to do is we've got to allow traffic from this audit network to go to the internet. Now we have a decision to make here. We can allow simply, because it's an audit network, any and all traffic to go out to the internet, basically give it an allow all rule, or we can make the audit computer run through the same rule set that all of the other systems run through, except begin to exempt specific portions of the policy set. That's what we're going to do. So I'm going to actually take our existing allow policies and deny policies, and we're going to add an additional source area from those. So I'm just going to right-click the rule, and we're going to see that we've got a from, so I'll simply add the audit network. And you'll see that the audit network is now added to this particular rule, as you can see here. But there's an easier way to do this, so we're going to do that now. We're going to go over to networking, and we're going to choose network sets. I'm going to create a new network set, and I'm going to call it internal and audit. And click Next. And I'm going to allow the audit and the internal network to be a member of this group. So this makes my life just a little bit easier, because now when I come back over to the Web Access Policy area, instead of having to manually select for every single rule that I create eventually, audit and internal, I can now remove both of these and add in the network set area internal and audit. And now I don't have to specify them separately. Again, that's only going to work in some cases. Every organization and every policy and every rule is going to be different. But in this case, it can make life a little bit easier. And I'll do the same thing for all the rules. And one more. With that change made, I'll now apply the new settings to the Threat Management Gateway system and click Apply. And bam, now we've got these new rules set in place, and we've got this brand new network in place too. This is a good thing. There's one other step we have to take, and that's to ensure that this new network is abiding by our NAT policies. As you can see right now, only the internal and the quarantine systems and VPN clients are subjected to NAT. That means that this new network, anything on it, will not be able to get out to the internet because we're not translating the address and we only have one IP address. So I'm going to right-click this rule, choose Properties, and under Source Networks, I'm going to add our audit network that we just created. And click Apply, and click OK. And then I'll apply these changes to our firewall. And once this takes place, I'll then go over to our workstation that's now reconfigured to work on this audit network, and we'll see how things are operating. And let's do that right now. And here we are at the client network, and as you can see, it's now sitting on the 10.2.1.10 IP address, which is the 10.2 network, which is not where it was before, and we do indeed have internet connectivity. And if I click Internet Explorer, we will see that I'm able to get out to websites as expected. However, I am still subjected to Threat Management Gateway policies. That's exactly what we wanted to happen, because what we're going to do next is enable the ability for this system to bypass malware inspection. Back over in the Threat Management Gateway console, we'll go to Web Access Policy, and we're going to come down to Configure Malware Inspection. So click that, and this time we're going to add a source exception, and we want to add the entirety of the audit network. Now this time we're not choosing the audit and internal because the audit network is the only one that is going to enjoy the ability to bypass malware inspection. So we make that change, click the OK button, and then we'll apply these settings to the Threat Management Gateway system. And we'll click OK. Now let's go over to the Windows 7 system on the audit network and attempt to download that iCar test file again. And here we see, scroll down just a little bit, and I'm just going to download the text file. But you'll notice it downloaded. Now, if I had done that before, it would not have been downloaded because back then we were applying malware inspection policies to the desktop. This time we exempted this machine so it was able to actually get this malware, and that's bad. I mean, it's good for demonstration purposes, but it's bad in a production environment. And just to prove to you that it would actually work, let me just click the iCar.com, and this time, rather than simply being blocked, I'm being asked if I want to save the file. And I could save the file wherever I like, and it downloads absolutely fine. But that's because we've exempted the computer from our malicious software inspection rules. But notice Windows has caught it and said, hey, I think there's something wrong. And Windows itself sees it. But again, this kind of goes back to the whole idea of defense in depth and at multi-layers. So it's nice that Windows caught it, but it's bad that it even got to the machine. If we can put things in place that prevent computers from ever seeing this, then the computers become a backstop, a second level of protection against these things rather than the first line of defense. And that's how we configure source exceptions. Now that example was a little bit more involved than it had to be, but I wanted to show you the right way to really go about doing this. Theoretically, you could have just gone and added any individual computer you wanted to that source exceptions area. But in this way, you got to understand how to add networks and how to really set up an environment that allows you to audit your network traffic in a more responsible way. Now, how do you keep all this current? Malware definitions are updated constantly, and keeping these definitions current is critically important in a signature-based system like Threat Management Gateway. By default, Threat Management Gateway downloads and updates definitions for you, and you simply have to tell the system that you want to do this, and that's actually the default. So you can have the system just stay at the default and check for updates and apply them. Or you can have the system simply check for updates and not apply them, or take no automatic action. And as you can see by the shot on your screen, by default it checks for and installs definitions every 15 minutes. Now it doesn't necessarily install definitions every 15 minutes, but it checks for new ones every 15 minutes. And if there are no updates for 5 days, an alert will be generated on Threat Management Gateway because that's too long for there to be no updates. You can have update frequencies of anywhere between 15 minutes and 4 hours. For Global Mantics, they actually want to change this to a 30-minute update interval. So we're going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway server and make this change right now. From the Threat Management Gateway console, we're just going to click Configure Malware Inspection, and this time we're going to go to Definition Updates. And we'll simply click the pull-down menu, choose every 30 minutes, and click OK. That's all there is to it. Once again, Configure Malware Inspection, Definition Updates, change the polling frequency. Very, very easy to do. And if you wanted to make a change to the automatic definition update action, you could do that here as well. And notice the green check mark. To receive definition updates, a valid subscription is required. By the way, if you want to check your license details, here they are. Notice we're operating under the evaluation license right now. And then we'd have to apply these changes to the firewall, and then those new changes would take effect with the next update cycle. It's important to make sure that when you're using malware inspection that you don't negatively impact the overall user experience. In other words, you want to make sure that users can stay productive even while you're protecting the organization. And there are a few things you can do, and a couple things we've already talked about in this lesson. First of all, you can relocate the TMG temporary disk cache to fast disks or to an array that has enough spindles to keep up with the expected workload. We discussed this process in the Forefront Threat Management Gateway Firewall Rules lesson in this course. You can also use Threat Management Gateway's malware inspection policies to your advantage, but there's also some disadvantage to it. Block files if scanning time exceeds 300 seconds, for example, is enabled. Basically, if a file is taking too long to scan, simply block it. Now, the nice part about this is eventually the user gets told within a reasonable amount of time that the file isn't going to download. But if they really need it, you've got to find a way to make that happen. By default, blocking files larger than 1,000 megabytes is another way that Threat Management Gateway helps make sure that the user experience is not negatively impacted. But, again, that can have negative consequences when it comes to the overall ability for users to get their work done. And again, blocking archive files with unpacked content larger than 4 gigs, likewise. The overarching theme here is to make sure that you're balancing security and usability. That's incredibly important in this whole process. Now, I'd like to talk about some content delivery options that you have at your disposal. First of all, it's important to understand what trickling means. First of all, trickling means that Threat Management Gateway will send small portions of a file directly through to the client even while the file is being inspected for malware. This helps to prevent the client application that's trying to download the file from timing out simply because Threat Management Gateway is taking too long with something. Small client portions are necessary in order to minimize the risk of infection. By sending a small piece of a file down to a client, Threat Management Gateway can help reduce the risk that it's going to send complete malware through to a client that may not be fully scanned. Trickling is performed for all types of files that are not specified for what are called progress notifications. If an infection is discovered, Threat Management Gateway will simply reset the download connection to prevent more of the file from being downloaded. There are 2 kinds of trickling. There's standard trickling, under which most of a file is actually kept on the Threat Management Gateway server while it's being scanned, and a little tiny bit of it is sent down to the client to keep that connection alive. The entire file is actually scanned, though, before being sent to the user. This is the most secure option. Fast trickling, on the other hand, sends data to the client as quickly as it's reasonable. However, the very last part of the downloaded file is held back so that the scan can be completed on the Threat Management Gateway server. This does provide an overall better experience for the user, but it does increase the risk of infection. Again, this is a case where you could use fast trickling to improve the overall user experience and then depend on tools that you have deployed on the desktop, for example, Forefront Endpoint Protection, to add an additional layer of security so that you can maintain a good user experience while maintaining security through multiple layers of defense. So if fast trickling resulted in an infection being sent to a client, the endpoint protection mechanism would take over and protect you in that case. When files are being downloaded, you can have Threat Management Gateway take over the job of making sure that users are notified about the progress of that download. Strangely enough, this feature is called Progress Notifications. Forefront pops up a web page that includes information about the content being downloaded and inspected by Threat Management Gateway. It also shows the user the progress of the downloaded file. Once the download and inspection are complete, the user is then notified that the content is ready and a download button is presented. This allows the user to then download the content from Threat Management Gateway. I should note, delivery option is not supported for HTTPS. You can manage progress notification content types in the Threat Management Gateway console. Whenever possible, progress notification content types are handled by MIME type. If that's not possible, Threat Management Gateway uses the file extension to determine the file type of the file. From a content delivery option perspective, Global Mantic is happy with the default options that are present in Threat Management Gateway. However, I'm going to start by going over to the Windows 7 machine we've been using in this course, and we're going to try out these options to see what happens when we try to download large content. From there, I'm going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway server itself and show you where you can find these options so you know where to change them for yourself. Before I move over to the Windows 7 machine, I do want to tell you that I have removed the Audit network from being exempt from Malware Inspection. By doing so, we're going to make this machine subjected to Malware Inspection policies once again. So I'm over here on the download machine, and I've gone to this large file download site that you saw before. And I've chosen to download the 100 megabyte file that you see on your screen. Now you can see what happens is basically Threat Management Gateway intercepts that file retrieval and starts downloading this on my behalf or on the behalf of this machine. And you can see that it's coming down relatively quickly and that the whole way you're being notified of exactly where the retrieval status sits. Okay, the file has now been completely downloaded and you get a notification to that effect. No malware was detected. This is a good thing. So now we'll click the download button and then we'll dig in to download the file to my computer here. And now you get the normal process that you're used to seeing when you try to download a file. You get the save dialog box, you click save, and the file downloads very, very, very quickly. Well, it's coming over a very fast connection. It's coming over a 100 meg connection because I'm not downloading it from the internet at this point. I'm downloading it from the Threat Management Gateway machine itself. So that's one way you can see where Malware Inspection can help you. And again, this all goes back to the defense in depth, multiple layers of security. So where do we configure our content delivery options? Well, we go to the Web Access Policy area and choose Configure Malware Inspection. And you're going to see that there's a Content Delivery tab up here in the upper left-hand corner. You can choose your trickling type, and then you can choose your content type exceptions. Would you rather use progress notification instead of the default content delivery method for selected content types? And what content types does this pertain to? And you're going to see that there's quite a few. And there's quite a few selected, including, as you saw before, zip files. If there's something that's on this list that Threat Management Gateway doesn't understand, it'll revert back to the other content delivery type trickling. Malware inspection depends on what's called the Microsoft Telemetry Service, which we discussed briefly in the Threat Management Gateway post-installation configuration tasks lesson. In that lesson, you learned that basic telemetry membership means that a little bit of information is shared and your basic experience is shared with others. Now, the telemetry service is a sharing mechanism. It's almost like a social media network for good malware people. This allows organizations to participate in this service by sending information to Microsoft that can improve the overall quality of the signatures being used. With a basic membership, again, a little bit of information is shared. With an advanced membership, quite a lot of information is shared when there's a potential for sensitive information to be sent to Microsoft. However, the results, if more people participate in the advanced membership, are better for everyone involved. So the organization has to make a decision about what level of membership they want to participate. Or you can choose not to participate at all. Again, this adds more information to the overall Microsoft Response Center so that they can better react to emerging threats. Now, we've talked a lot in this lesson about configuring overall malware inspection rules on a global basis. However, for each web access rule you create, you can actually have your own malware inspection options attached to it. So basically, for a particular rule, you can override the global malware inspection policies and apply new ones. If the rule allows HTTP traffic, you can decide if scanning is performed for content that the rule allows to be downloaded. Basically, do you want to allow content to be downloaded? You need to select the Use Rule-Specific Settings for Malware Inspection option to modify malware inspection settings on a per-rule basis. I also want to talk about one other option before we go over to the Threat Management Gateway server. It's called the Forceful Content Request option, which removes HTTP range headers. This forces Threat Management Gateway to request the full content so that it can be evaluated as a whole. Now, this might not sound like a big deal, but it actually can be, because it carries a better success rate since threats can be more completely detected. Think about the fact that you could split, for example, a virus signature in half by looking at content in a split way. By making sure that you're scanning the entire contents of a file rather than just pieces of it, you can avoid that kind of problem. When it comes to malware options, if HTTPS inspection is enabled on the Threat Management Gateway server, then HTTPS content will be scanned. We'll be covering HTTPS inspection in the Implementing HTTPS Inspection lesson in this course. Now, I'm going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway server, and we're going to take a look at malware options on a rule. So here we are at the Threat Management Gateway server, and we've got our allow rule. So I'm going to right-click that allow rule and go to the properties. And you're going to see that there's a malware inspection tab here. And we've got three options. We can inspect content downloaded from web servers to clients. That's pretty self-explanatory. Forceful content requests, which I talked about just a minute ago. And then we can choose to use rule-specific settings for malware inspection. By doing so, you enable the rule settings box, which is going to provide you with some familiar options. Now, I'm not going to go through all these options because I've talked about them before in this lesson, but they're the exact same options you got to see before. What kinds of files do you want to block? Large files, corrupted files, files that can't be scanned, encrypted files, what have you. So for a specific rule, you can override those global settings that you've created. So let's say you wanted to have a rule that just allowed one or two machines to go out to the internet in a more restricted way. You could configure their malware inspection settings differently than the rest of the organization. Global Mantics made some important decisions in this lesson. They chose to use the Advanced Telemetry Reporting Services membership, which we actually talked about earlier in this course. We changed our file size limit to 2 gigs, and we stopped the blocking of encrypted files. We created exceptions so that all globalmantics.com sites and the perimeter network were exempt from malware inspection. We also created an audit computer network in the IT department so that we can protect other computers on the network. We modified malware inspection policies so that definitions will be updated every 30 minutes. And although we didn't do this, Global Mantics is also going to enable fast trickling for an improved user experience. And let's go do that right now. So we'll go to Configure Malware Inspection, Content Delivery, and we'll choose Fast Trickling. Then we apply the rule. And you'll notice that we now disabled this feature because everything's going to undergo fast trickling. And click OK. And again, we apply our firewall rules. And that's all there is to it. This lesson covered a lot of ground, and we started with a discussion on what malware inspection actually accomplishes. Then we talked about how you get malware inspection and how you have to license the malware inspection feature. Next, we discussed how malware protection operates, and you learn how to configure overall malware inspection policies, including excluding resources from particular inspection rules. Next, you learn how to update malware definitions and how some of the options associated with that, and you learn how to optimize the user experience through appropriate creation of malware policies. From there, we moved on to choosing different content delivery options, and then you gain an understanding of the purpose of the Microsoft Telemetry Service, and we wrapped up with a discussion about rule-based malware options. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.